Hello, and welcome to the Stat Nerd Draft Report. Today will be the first mailbag episode, and to help me answer some of these questions from the listeners is Jacob Goldstein, a writer from Real Ball Insider and contributor at Nylon Calculus, Josiah Brady, also a contributor for Nylon Calculus, and at Advanced Stats 23, one of the hands-down best Twitter follows you can make. So from at Dave93Rick, Hezi Pull Up Jimbo. There's been a lot of talk on draft Twitter about the value of certain archetypes and how they relate to winning at the highest level. Specifically with more traditional bigs, do you think there's merit in considering this as a draft evaluation tool? For example, do you fade Rudy Gobert types? Jacob, I'm going to throw it to you first.
I think you have to a certain degree. Like, if you have a chance to get a defender as good as Rudy Gobert in the draft, you probably still take him. But you definitely have to consider with the amount of spacing and the amount of movement required from bigs on the defensive end nowadays that you'll have to gear your playoff defense around putting them in positions to succeed. So, like, last year, what the Spurs did when they were playing the Rockets, they had Pau Gasol as their rim protector, and so they forced the Rockets into shots with Pau Gasol right there or taking mid-range shots, which at the time last year they were really adverse to. So I think there's ways you can gear a defense around more limited mobility players. Obviously, Gobert has quite a bit more mobility than Pau Gasol, but I think you definitely have to consider it in your big board when you're trying to win. The goal is to win a championship, and if you're going to draft a player who has limitations that can be exploited, especially in the playoffs where everything is brought out, that's a flaw. I think you definitely have to consider it and sort of demerit it a little. And then on the other end, a guy like Clint Capella, who's in a regular season game not as good as Gobert defensively, but Capella can switch on to anyone and be pretty much just fine. So you then have to add a little extra value to that. And I think that's just the game is evolving so quickly right now in relation to spacing and movement on the defensive end for bigs that guys who would have gone higher in the draft even last year or 2 years ago are going to fall a little bit more, even if they're really good players in a regular season game, just because it's easily exploitable in the highest leverage situations by really good offenses.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you mean there. I think it comes down to how many players are perfect players that can't be exploited. At Advanced Stats, what do you think?
I think there is some merit to it. I've been kind of thinking about it for a while, and it was brought up last year also that at times, like, Rudy Gobert gets kind of exploited against the Warriors and the Rockets, but you also have to consider that the Rockets are like the worst possible matchup for Gobert. It's not just them that he could play in the playoffs. Like, he looked perfectly fine against Oklahoma City, and they run a bunch of stuff. And I don't know. I think you do have to consider it for your big board to a certain extent, but also, like, for Mo Bamba, kind of like in that thing, if you project him to be an elite defender, I'm not saying I do or don't, but if you do, he's still going to be very valuable, even if he's like +2 in the playoffs defensively rather than +3.5 during the regular season.
Yeah, Bomba's probably the closest comp to Gobert. I think it's just a matter of how likely do you think it is that he gets to that level. If it's his 95th percentile, then you start to worry. If it's 70th percentile, I think that's very generous. But if you believe it's that, then he should be top 3 on your big board for sure. I think it's really just weighting what you think is his absolute ceiling versus more of an expected ceiling. And as far as Gobert versus the Rockets, he really didn't do, I don't think, a poor job at all. I mean, Chris Paul was hitting the toughest shots seen against him, and Harden didn't have the greatest series. Josiah, what do you think about these Rudy Gobert types going forward?
Yeah, I think it's pretty sound the analysis so far because, while it was difficult for Rudy to actually be competent on the court against one of the best teams really ever, I would say, probably in the top 15, even if they don't win a championship because they're playing against another team that's also one of the greatest teams. But if we turn away for a minute from teams that can exploit bigs and talk about some other teams that are more regular, I guess. Like we see against Oklahoma City only was able to score about 45% around the rim in their series, and Gobert essentially just thwarted their attempts or spooks them into taking attempts of just a lot less expected value. So if I'm a team in the early stages of the draft, I guess it depends on the content of my roster, but I'm not exactly aiming to completely stifle some of the best teams and some of the most difficult matchups when I'm trying to come up with a selection for a rim protecting big or someone who can at least discourage attempts around the rim. I'm probably trying to beat teams that are more towards the median.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's about expectations of who you want to beat. There's definitely critiques. I think if you want to set your level as championship or bust for the Rudy Gobert types, if you expect to play Chris Paul or Stephen Curry and Kevin Durant every playoffs, but I mean, I think that there's going to be some years. I mean, depending on your conference, obviously, that's also important. But there's going to be some years where it's just you're not going to have to go through both of those matchups like the Jazz would have had to do this year for, I guess, people to consider the Gobert type a non-flawed archetype. But it's really just to me how many other players are there that bring the kind of impact that he brings that can get you to that championship level in the first place. Maybe it's not a surefire win that you win the series with him, but I think he gives you a fighting chance, especially, if Chris Paul doesn't play at just superhuman levels these past few games. I think the Jazz had a decent chance to win the series. Harden wasn't on top of his game, that's for sure. And, I mean, it just takes Harden being off his game, and maybe, last year that would have been enough because they didn't have Chris Paul, and the Rockets were a 55-win team then. So it really just depends on who you play and what your expectations are. And I think as you go forward, it's hard to project what kind of defenses are going to be what we're going to be seeing in 5-10 years. I think we could possibly see an influx of zone defense, not throughout the entire game, just sprinkled here and there. So, I mean, it's really tough to fade an archetype that can make a huge impact if you're confident that they will in fact get to that level of impact.
I think that's a fair way to look at it. My when I said I think you have to consider it, I meant as in if you have two guys who are in a pretty similar tier, almost if you get to choose between Gobert and Capella or something like that, and you're trying to compete at the highest level, I can see value in giving a little priority towards taking a guy who you think could switch and move better. But it's not like someone's going to not draft Gobert or a guy who is going to become a Gobert just because of one defensive flaw based off all the other defensive value he adds. He was still a useful player in the Rockets series. It was just less useful because the Rockets are the Rockets and can take advantage of everything offensively.
It is just a matter of he was just less useful than he had been. Those calling him an Achilles heel, I think that's just an over-exaggeration, to say the least. All right, so on to the next question from @bball strategy. Players you think will have better RPM than their box score alone suggests. Players most likely to get 30-plus minutes per game as a rookie. And lottery pick less ready to contribute in year one. Let's go ahead and throw this one to you, Advanced Stats.
For the last question, I think there are a couple obvious choices. Mo Bamba is very, very skinny, and he's a one-position center basically. So, and very raw offensively. So he's an obvious choice. Another one, if he goes in the lottery, it's no lock, but I think Kevin Knox has a long way to go on the defensive end, and it's a playmaker to really contribute at the NBA level. I think those are two guys. For another question you asked about the RPM, I think Kenrick Williams, Javon Carter, a couple guys. I'm not super high on Javon Carter, but he's got really active hands. He has a chance to be a good defender. The issue I have is his penetration is like non-existent for a point guard. So we'll see if he can stick in the league. Kenrick Williams is like this all-around wing that can do a little bit of everything. And what was the other question?
Player most likely to get 30-plus minutes per game as a rookie?
I think that's pretty obvious. I mean, bigs rarely get that high of minutes. So Trae Young is an obvious one. Luka Doncic is an obvious one. Maybe DeAndre Ayton of the bigs. But those are the guys that I would say the guys that are going to go near the top are guys that could get 30 minutes plus a game.
And Josiah, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, sure. So for the first question, as far as RPM goes, and specifically because of his projected D RPM, I'd probably go with Jaren Jackson, simply because I think it's quite possible that he becomes someone who can block shots of expected value, like near the rim, and that I guess that's also contingent upon whether he's gonna be able to rebound at a significant level. Because if not, then of course he might be forced to play the four, and it could potentially take away from some of his like defensive upside if he's not taking away shots at the rim. I don't know. I would prefer to see a scenario like that, I guess. But definitely like Advanced Stats 23 said, in terms of being likely to play 30-plus minutes a game, it's dependent upon the system that they're in, the team that they're in, and their position, of course. I don't know if teams themselves have like that as far as like load on players' knees, but I don't know if that would entail that like bigs are like more likely to have like lingering injuries if they were to play in an inordinate amount of minutes early on in their careers. But as far as Trae, Luka, and maybe there would be some other guys I would pick if they were to have gone earlier in the draft. Like I think Sexton would have like the capability to play 30 minutes, but not the capability to play them well. So that obviously would take away from his upside in terms of minutes played. The lottery pick that's the least ready to contribute year one, is that what that's saying?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't know how likely it would be for Bamba to be able to play at a level that's like conducive to positive net ratings that early on in his career, simply because I'm not sure what we should expect from him and his shooting. Of course, he can probably be effective if he's like doing a lot of putbacks and in play types that you can't really like manufacture by strategy alone. They're kind of just happenstance, but I guess I would pick him.
I hope we didn't all pick Bamba for our player least likely ready to contribute. Jacob, who did you have for those and the others?
I mean, it's probably Bamba. But in a more interesting, just to give a more interesting answer, I think Kevin Knox is a guy who is, some mocks have him high enough to be a lottery pick, and I really don't think he's that close to being ready. I could see a more fringe lottery guy like Lonnie Walker or something like that, like some of these more low-end lottery picks who might get in there if they have a really good workout with the team. I could see those kinds of guys maybe struggling a bit early on to really make a difference. As for player most likely to get 30 minutes. It's Doncic, and depending on what team takes them, I agree with what everyone else has said. It's some of the guards who, if they go to the right team, could really get a chance to play 30, 32 minutes per game and dominate their team's offenses. Who I think will probably have a better RPM than their box score suggests. I could see someone like Zaire Smith, if he gets enough time, really being able to put up some good RPM numbers. But outside of that, it's probably Jaren Jackson. I don't think he's going to put up any crazy stats as a rookie, but I assume he'll, based off like the on-off he's had in college and how he projects to play as a pro, I think he'll have pretty nice on-off numbers and could end up with a really high RPM compared to what is typical for a rookie big coming into the league.
I think Jaren Jackson's ability to both spread the floor and protect the rim is going to be instrumental in, boosting that RPM past what people I think are expecting it just from looking at his box score. That's a good answer. Some other names I had, I agree with advanced stats on Kenrich Williams. I had him first on my list. Justin Jackson from Maryland, I think, is someone that's probably not likely to contribute, but if he does contribute, he's someone whose RPM can definitely kind of similar to Covington, Otto Porter. I don't think he's going to be that high because I don't think he's that good of a player. He's never going to be that good of a player, but similar to how theirs is higher than people would expect, I think he could be in that tier. Jalen Brunson, I think, could have a really high offensive RPM. He's just an amazing offensive player, and if his shot translates, he's going to be shifting defenses. Player for most likely to get 30-plus minutes, I think y'all are right with Trey, Doncic. Bagley is someone who I know he's big, but I think he's just got a ton of energy. He keeps running. He's just a rare breed of athlete, and I think 30 minutes isn't going to be an issue for him given that the situation he's in allows for it. Like I already said, I have Bamba as well on the lottery pick, least ready to contribute. He's just – the potential's there, but it's a long-term process with him in my opinion. All right, let's go on to the next question from at Har Connor. Connor's awesome friend of the show. Which prospects below your top 30 on your board have the best chance of improving their stock at the combine? Josiah, I'm going to throw it to you first.
Well, I would hope, because of how much I like his name, that Abudu Salamu, Abudu Rexity, I think that's his name. He's from China. I would hope that he gets an opportunity to go to the combine and can have success based upon my my bias towards his name. But if I were to give another player who is more likely, then I think I'd say Raleigh Elkins. I would say that simply because of his athleticism and his injury history and how that kind of hid a bit of his athleticism, I guess, per se. But I'd also have to say that I didn't make a rigorous top 30, so yeah.
Hey, that just gives you more leeway, man.
Right. Trey Young, man. Trey Young.
My first name I'll give is Melvin Frazier. I think he could really dominate the combine. As for Raleigh Elkins, I'm not a huge fan of his because I've seen he's a little bit of a hothead, I think, and I don't know if he's going to kill it in the interviews. But we'll see. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I hope I'm wrong because I don't want to see anyone be a hothead. I don't want to see anyone to actually cost them money. But we'll see.
A little undersized, too.
He is. Jacob, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to go with my original answer when we were discussing before the pod. So when I first read this question, I totally skipped over the top 30 part and just focused on, who I think is going to have the best combine to their stock sort of thing. And the obvious answer to me is DeAnthony Melton, especially if he shoots, which I somehow doubt. But I think he is a guy who can do just a little bit of everything really well except shooting. And if he can really prove that he's taken this past year and really worked on that and refined his skill, he's a guy who I could see flying up boards as we get closer to the actual draft.
I admire your cheating because I was gonna do it too if I
Gotta
had
do it.
top 30, man. Advanced stats. Who's your name or names?
One guy I'm really interested in is Josh Okaji, I think. I know a lot of people are pretty hot on him in draft Twitter, and I'm interested to see how his athleticism testing comes out. I'm pretty sure he got invited to the combine, right?
I would assume so. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in him. Kevin Hurter is another guy. I totally mispronounced that. I don't know how to
Where's he
pronounce
from?
that.
Maryland.
Maryland. He's a really interesting guy offensively. He can really shoot. He's got a little bit of pick and roll ability to him. I'm really interested in him. Though I did have him in my top 30 barely, but I'm gonna throw him out there also.
Hey, we're already cheating. Why not keep cheating? I like it. My last name is Jared Vanderbilt out of Kentucky. He didn't have a great season in the few games he played there, but he looks fluid in the open court. He's a monster on the rebounds. Like if he gets there and he's playing against dudes who aren't giving it all their all, and he's gonna just destroy the rebounds. It's not even gonna be close. I mean, if he could flash some kind of shooting touch, that'd be nice. I don't even know if he shot a three. I don't think he made one. So, I mean, it's kind of limits what kind of role he can play, but as like an energy big off the bench, you could maybe come out and defend in space. Kind of intriguing to me.
Did he sign with an agent already?
I'm not sure if he did or not. I'd have to check. I haven't honestly gone over the agent work yet. I still have to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I honestly haven't looked into him as diligently as I probably should. I just watched while I'm being eye test right now. I watched Kentucky pretty often, and even when he came back to play, it might have been just by virtue of how like uncomfortable their system is generally. But of course, there were just like mid-range shots. Like there weren't defined roles for each player, and obviously, when someone who doesn't have like the purest jumper, like the purest like evasion dribbling, tries that very often, it's just not like a recipe for success.
I agree with you on that totally. I think that it was just the worst possible system probably for him in terms of coming in for a few games and trying to find a role in there. It's really difficult. The guys who usually look good there, I think, look good over time. Like they don't necessarily look amazing at the beginning of the season. Gilgeous-Alexander is an example of that. He looked really amazing at the end of the season, but if you would just look at his first few games and watch those and judge him, you probably wouldn't like him as a prospect, I would assume. All right, so it's time for us to eat some crow. At Alex West NBA, one of my partners for the draft guide I do, asked, over the past few drafts, who has been your biggest miss in the past few drafts? And who are your biggest underrated hits? So I'm going to go ahead and go first because this is going to be embarrassing. I just want to get it off my chest. I had Jaylen Brown at 12 on my big board. So that's looking pretty bad right now. We're going to go ahead and let Jacob get his miss out of the way, and he can go on to his hit if he wants also, and go ahead and list multiple hits if you want to boost your esteem back up after that.
My biggest miss is probably from the 2015 draft, which was before I really started following analytically super closely. But it was Mario Hezonja. I loved Hezonja's game. I loved how much junk he talked. I only ever I was totally in on Hezonja. There was some big game where he like hit a three and started talking to the other team's coach, and I was all in on
international.
Yeah. I thought he was gonna be real good. Well, I might not. I mean, I still hold out hope that his last 30 games of this season are gonna end up being who he is going forward. I guess because he had a pretty decent run to end the year, but
he did ball out.
Yeah, he's definitely fallen quite a bit short of what I was hoping for. Biggest hit, It's probably like Miles Turner or maybe Rondé Hollis Jefferson. I really liked Hollis Jefferson coming out of college and was just hoping he would somehow fall far enough in that draft to the Spurs. But he's probably underwhelmed a little compared to what I expected, but he's been really solid pro. He still can't shoot, but he sort of shifted over to power forward and has found a way to be a really effective player in the league. So, I mean, I'll pat myself on the back for that one.
Hey,
Yeah, I really liked Rondé too. I think I probably had the same expectations for him as you did. I always thought he was a power forward, honestly. I thought it was weird that they were playing him at the 2 and just depriving their team of any spacing whatsoever when he can guard most forwards no problem. Josiah, let's go ahead and go to you next.
let's see. There's definitely been some misses for me. I would say particularly because of like some ingrained biases. I like players who have one motion jumpers, and I like players who like like prototypical athletes, and that sometimes without statistical support is like a recipe for over or being bullish when you shouldn't, or underestimating a player in the playoffs. I mean, in the league. I definitely liked players like Emmanuel Mudiay before the draft, and maybe that was because of the college versus like pro type of like bias, where you see a player who does like an unorthodox move and goes to China. It's like, like this player must be in line for like something impactful in the future. So
Can't pass on Brandon Jennings when you get a chance.
right, I thought players like that would be really nice. And also, I don't think Justice Winslow is like bad per se, but because when I was in college, people called me Justice Winslow, saying that I looked like Justice Winslow. I I grew fond of Justice Winslow, and he still can't shoot. He still can't shoot at all. So I would say that's like somewhat of a miss. Last season, and I'll move on to hits now. Last season, I think I was also biased because I watched Jason Tatum when he was in high school, as a junior and a senior, because I went to school in St. Louis as well. And I remember I tweeted, I said, like by the time like Jason Tatum reaches his peak will be more impactful than that of DeMar DeRozan. And I think that's like somewhat likely now.
It's already happened.
Especially right. I didn't want to say that much, but because of the hate, but whatever.
I'll take all the hate, man. Don't worry. At Hoops Metro.
Yeah. What's so shocking and what's so astounding about what Brad Stevens was able to do with him was that in college we saw that he had isolative tendencies in plays and in sets, and that's really something that really dated all the way back to high school. In high school, like say he was wide open from 3, he would never catch and shoot in high school. He'd always catch, maybe do a size up dribble or 2, and then step into the shot. And because he was 6'8", no one's going to stop him. No one's going to block that shot. He could do whatever he wanted. But the frequency with which he isolates has diminished, of course, because of the way Brad Stevens would prefer them to play. And then he has like really strong communicative skills on the defensive end, and like a 3-pointer that I really wouldn't have expected this early on. So I would say Jason.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes to the point of how important is it that a coach can get his team to buy into his philosophy. And obviously, Brad Stevens, from all accounts, I've seen multiple players just say like he's head and shoulders above what the rest of the coaches, not the rest of the coaches, but what most coaches in the league are doing right now. advanced stats, go ahead and give us your hits and misses, all that.
One of my bigger misses is Stanley Johnson. I really liked how he played out of Arizona. I think I felt a little bit too much for just like how tough he was and how strong he was. Though his skill level, I probably overestimated. I thought he would be a two-way impact guy, and right now he looks like pretty much bad. Just like a bad player in every way possible. And one of my bigger hits is from the same draft. I think I had Miles Turner in my top 5, and I think he's going to be a really good player. He's still young. He had a little bit of injury issues this past year, but I think he's still going to be a stud.
Yeah, I mean, Miles disappointed me a little bit in the postseason this year, to be honest. I mean,
He
offensively.
did that last year too.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll see if he can turn around. I don't think he's at the point where you make any kind of statements about the career just off of 2 short stints. So we'll see where he goes from this. My underrated hit, and I probably didn't even have him high enough already just looking at what he's doing, is OG Anunoby. But just based on draft, where he went in the draft, I had him at 8, and I feel like he's already proven that he's going to be at least that good of a player. Let's go on to the next question from JLloyd952. Who's the prospect with the largest gap between their ceiling and floor? Advanced stats, go ahead and give me your prospect.
I mean, I think it's obviously DeAndre Ayton. For me, I just think that if you find a way to get his defense to being above average, and if he shoots, which isn't out of the realm of possibility, he could be an absolute star, like a legendary good player. But at the same time, there are some defensive indicators that can suggest he'll be a big negative on that end, to where he might be unplayable in big spots in the playoffs. And we don't have enough data to know if he's going to shoot or not. And I think in the IBL, I think he shot pretty poorly, if I remember right, from 3. So he's also had questions ever since high school about his motor and those kind of things, and the effort issues, and how much he actually likes the game of basketball. So I think he's kind of obviously the answer for me.
Spoiler, my answer too. Jacob, what about you?
I actually think it's Trae Young. I just think if his defense is at, like, I think he's going to be a good offensive player. Like, there's a range of outcomes that come about with that, but I think at the very, like, if nothing works out, he's Patty Mills on the offensive end. If it all works out, he's Damian Lillard with better passing type player. But I think his defense could go from below average to like abysmal. This guy needs to be played in very specific situations.
Do you think he's potentially worse than IT, or is IT his floor?
That's probably his floor. Like Isaiah Thomas, Lou Williams, that area I think could be his floor. He would have to be real bad to do worse than Isaiah Thomas on the defensive end.
Yeah,
So I think
what I was thinking.
I think he ranges from being like the worst defender in the league to just like a run-of-the-mill bad point guard defender. And I think that could have a huge impact on his eventual role in the NBA, because if he's a horrible defender and he doesn't reach the higher ends of his offensive output, I think that makes him like a sixth man, maybe, to worse. Whereas if everything works out, he's a insanely elite player. So I mean, Ayton is another good answer for that. Bamba is the decent answer for that, I think, just because if his body never really fills out right, his defensive potential could kind of become a moot point. And if his shot isn't there, he gets even worse. I think Bagley also kind of falls into that, though not to the same degree, because his motor will make him, at the very least, a solid bench big. But he also has a little of that boom bust type potential in him.
I think Trey's offense is going to be good enough that I don't consider him in this as much as Ayton. And then, like you said with Bagley, his motor, I think, keeps him probably afloat. Bamba would probably be my second answer as well. Josiah, what do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting point about Trae Young. I think that what's encouraging from an offensive perspective with him is that how infrequently they utilized off-screen play. Everything he did potentially was, pretty much was just motion weak, and then into a high pick and roll, which got doubled, and then his teammates were like kind of useless the majority of the time.
It's understatement.
Yeah. So thankfully, especially if a coach like pays attention to his off-screen points per possession, even though it's with a really low sample size, I think there's something there with that because of his one motion shot, his quick release, and just quickness and balance for his shot. But if I were going to answer the question, which I'm going to right now, I'd probably be agreeing with everyone else with Bamba specifically because of his defensive potential, like the 95th percentile of his defensive potential is like switchability on everyone, elite blocking at the rim, so distorting the most important or some of the highest, most valuable shots. And I think I'll just go with like kind of a wild card and say Lonnie, simply because right now, obviously Lonnie is like an extraordinary athlete, but we can't say a whole lot else about it. Like, of course, if he's able to refine his like 3-point ability, it's like a lot more interesting. And then his like proficiency at the rim, that would make him something that's like definitely worth paying attention to. But as of right now, like we don't have much evidence that he's going to be able to make plays for others or shoot at any consistent rate. So I'll add him in.
I think there's definitely some unknown to his game that is intriguing. Could have that high ceiling. I've seen him compared to Jimmy, like a smaller Jimmy Butler. I mean, that would be really impressive from a strength and defensive standpoint, and maybe he's that strong. But I've heard from people that have worked out with Jimmy, and he's just a freak. So, maybe Lonnie does have that upside. Let's go ahead and move on to the final question for today from Ben Thrifty. Do you think age is currently overrated, underrated, or properly rated in most prospect discussions? Josiah, let's keep it on you.
Yeah, this is probably one of my favorite questions, simply because it really it can get at our at our biases for sure. Because sometimes when we think of youth, we think of the youngest players in the draft, we think, there's so much time. There's so much time to refine those skills. Like, even if they don't have those skills right now, you have plenty of time to mold that player into a great player, an impactful player. We just need time. But of course, that's not like always a reasonable approach. If a player who has good size and who's really young doesn't have any of the requisite skills, it's not a guarantee that he'll become a player who has those requisite skills at the pro level. So it's hard for me to say. It's kind of contingent upon the player. Of course, some players you'd wish were younger because they seem to have like a sound understanding of the game. But I don't know. You got to ask some of these other guys, and then I might chime in again later because I don't have the data for it right now.
I think it depends on role. To me, a big thing. Like if you know that you want a 3-and-D player, and you think this dude can step in and do it, he doesn't need to grow. And I mean, he will need to grow defensive end because no rookie really. I'm not gonna say no rookie because I just saw Jason Tatum put up the season he did and Ben Simmons. But most rookies are not ready to contribute defensively, and so I mean, like they're gonna have to grow. But there's prospects that, despite maybe being older, you have more confidence that they're gonna hit the level that you need to. But when you're taking the home run pick, the age does start to matter. Jacob, what are your thoughts here?
I think I'm going to go with both. It's very dependent on the player. I think there's a lot of guys who get passes when they're younger, and the assumption that they're gonna just magically improve just because they're younger sometimes gets applied to them. And then I think there are guys who are older who get sort of left to the side or moved down a tier just because they're older. And I think generally that's a mistake. I think what's important is how good someone is for their age, especially when it comes to scoring. So like in my draft model, scoring is much more important. If you're a young guy and you score 17 points in college, that's really impressive. Whereas if you're a 22-year-old, 23-year-old doing that, that's really not the same. So I think it's kind of skill dependent. I think it's also player dependent. And I think one thing that I've seen coming out of recent drafts is the guys who work the hardest, regardless of how old they are, those are the guys who should be tagged with having the most potential. Like just the guys who are willing to get into the gym and do 6 hours a day of working out. I think that's kind of a skill that's undervalued. And I think that's more important than ages in terms of how much someone's going to improve in the NBA. So it's kind of both, and it's kind of neither, which is a pretty good non-answer, I think.
Very fair points and way to remain neutral there. Advanced stats, what do you think?
I think it's I'd say it's neutral. I mean, when you look at these draft models, they do account for age usually pretty heavily. And I think Jacob said a good point that we should just look at how good he is for his age. Like there's like a linear progression that if you're a senior and you're not great, what are the odds that you're going to contribute in the NBA? They're very low. And if you're a freshman and people believe in the jumper, but maybe you shot 33% from three, you can still believe in the jumper. This reminds me of I think Bradley Beal didn't shoot that well from three in Florida, but all the scouts believed in a jumper, and now he's like a really good shooter in the NBA. So I think maybe a little underrated, but there are definitely examples for both sides of the equation. And one thing you should keep in mind is if the senior is really good, how good was he as a freshman also? And if he shot well from three, like, is it an outlier year? Or because we need to look at the sample, because the sample's still small. Like, if a guy's shooting 40% from three on 140 3-point attempts, and then the last year he shot, let's say, 32%, we need to account for that also.
Sample sizes in college are so small that you use all the data you can, really. I mean, it is like, oh, this happened 3 years ago. How relevant is that? But, I mean, when that's all the stats you have to look at, I mean, it stays relevant to a point. Maybe you kind of put you weight the years maybe more heavily towards the end, but the beginning also has to come into at least consideration. But development isn't linear either, so it's tough to get into that, oh, well, he wasn't good as a freshman, so you got to discount him now.
I was going to make one quick point on that because you actually even mentioned weighting. In my draft model for college players, earlier seasons, so I take the 3 most recent seasons available for a player, or up to 3. And earlier seasons, I've found, and other research I've seen has had the same conclusions, that earlier seasons actually matter more than younger or than like a senior year. So I actually weight a sophomore year more heavily than a senior year. Just that statistically does much better in terms of projecting players, which I think has to do with, as guys get older, a 22, 23-year-old is able to physically dominate college just because they're more developed. It might not necessarily be that they are a more skilled or a better pro prospect just because they're suddenly 22 playing against 20-year-olds.
Now, when you say shooting, do you mean just like effective field goal percentage or a 3-point percentage?
In general, it matters just more almost what someone did when they were younger in college than older. Just because if you're 23, you're going to be physically stronger in all likelihood than the freshman you might be playing against or the other sophomore you're playing against. So I've statistically found it's more important to wait earlier seasons in college more heavily than more recent seasons.
Interesting.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, that seems pretty reasonable simply because I'm hearing more on Chandler Hutchison like late in his Boise State career now. But per 40 minutes, like he was averaging about like 14 points as a sophomore. And now, the most recent year, he averaged like 26 per 40 and then also increases like 3-point rate and his 3-point efficiency. But it's like somewhat late in his career. And that also hasn't been accompanied with like a broader shoulders or like filling out his body. He's 22 years old and still like pretty skinny, man.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense. That's interesting. I had never heard that, but you know, once the idea is out there, you kind of like, okay, yeah, that does make sense. All right, well, I think we had an excellent podcast today. I'm going to let each of you plug your own handle, any work you have coming up or have recently released. Go ahead and plug that in. Jacob, we'll start with you.
All right, my Twitter handle is at Jacob E. Goldstein, all is one word. I just yesterday, or when this comes out, it might be 2 or 3 days ago, released my updated draft model, so you guys can check that out. And also look out for the Nylon Calculus playoff previews for the Eastern and Western Conference Finals, which should be dropping this weekend.
And Josiah?
So one of the latest things I did, it's almost like I've become like I was talking to David Hines actually, and on Twitter, and we were saying that like we're basically like, yeah, he's tight. We're basically saying that we're like analytic mods now because I haven't really written anything since the summer, so it's more of just like trying to like mitigate conflict and like use mathematics and like support people who do good work, like but I think one of the most recent things I put out was hierarchical clustering, like for team evaluation.
I remember that was good.
With thanks with 94 feet report actually. I think I'm slated to do an NBA Finals preview for Def Pen Hoops soon. But yeah, I have some stuff on Nylon Calculus. Shout out to the team. There's just a lot of people there who really have like edified my own journey through analytics and basketball watching in general. Yeah.
And advanced stats.
Advanced stats 23, and I don't have much coming out. I don't write much, but my Twitter handle will. On my Twitter, I say a lot of different things, and so you'll know my opinions. Maybe I put it out too strongly about how I feel about certain players.
I love it though.
Yeah, you gotta be yourself, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't even recall if Josiah put his handle in there, but his handle is probably one of the best ones. Go ahead and tell him.
It's at steady losing.
There you go. Yeah. All right.
Despite wanting to encourage people to like care about like getting players who are conducive to winning, I'm all about losing, according to my handle.
Yeah, I saw your handle like a while back, and I was like, wow, I'm jealous. Anyways, my handle is at hoopsmetrox, HOOPSMETROX, and I just had version 1.2 of the 94 Feet Draft Guide come out today. So check that out at the94feetreport.com, or it's actually on Medium, the 94 Feet Report. And like, follow, share the show, and everyone have an excellent day.